from West Virginia and I moved all the way to Lexington, Kentucky for a girl. Now that might be the scariest part of the story, that a dude from West Virginia moved over the border to Kentucky and only for a girl, but I assure you, it gets worse. A lot worse. She was super affectionate when we first got together, like I couldn't have wished for a better girlfriend. But as time went on and we got more secure in the whole thing, that affection dropped off to next to nothing. It was a slow process, almost like a leaky bucket or something. I barely noticed the relationship dropping off bit by bit until one day I just realized that there was nothing left of us. We were like roommates more than anything, hardly spent any time together, didn't actually get intimate for like months at a time, and in the end, sleeping in the same bed as her was so depressing that I ended up just staying on the couch. Not long after I started calling the couch my bed, we broke up formally. It sucked, but I saw it coming a long way off, and it wasn't entirely unwelcome. And that's when I started talking to this girl on Reddit. Now, I should make it perfectly clear that I was never ever unfaithful to my girlfriend. Only when we broke up, I was so starved for affection and female attention that I looked for it wherever I could. I wasn't confident for dating apps, I don't think, so Reddit's anonymity suited me just fine. Eventually, me and this girl that I met on the r/gaming sub swapped numbers and actually started planning to meet. She lived over in Arizona, but flying down there to meet her didn't seem like a big deal at all, not when she was so nice and pretty too. I remember staying up super late talking to her one night, trying to keep my voice down so my ex wouldn't hear. We planned all the stuff we'd do together, all the places that she'd take me in Phoenix, all the bomb Mexican food we were going to eat. I was excited, and I went to sleep smiling, but I sure didn't wake up that way. I woke up to loud crashing noises just feet away from me in the TV room. At first, I thought it was a home invasion or something, but when I looked around, it was her, my ex, and she was smashing my Xbox with a baseball bat over and over again. I screamed at her, asking her what she thought she was doing, then went to grab my phone so I could call the cops. Only it wasn't on the coffee table, where I usually put it on charge every night. It was nowhere to be seen. That's when my ex started ranting about how I'd been cheating, how she knew everything, and then mentioned the Reddit girl by name before she swung at me with the baseball bat. I fell backwards over the couch trying to avoid the strike, and I did, but Jesus Christ, the whole rush of air as it went past my face just about put the fear of God into me. She chased me around the apartment, swinging that bat as hard as she could until I locked myself in our bathroom. I thought I might be able to reason with her from the other side of the door, to be able to actually explain that the Reddit girl was someone I started talking to after we broke up. But she actually tried to bash the door down, and I'm still amazed that she didn't manage it. Like it was legit like that scene from The Shining. She bashed a hole in one of the wood panels and proceeded to scream through that. Thank God it wasn't big enough for her to reach through and unlock the door, otherwise I'd have been in some serious trouble. Eventually she calmed down enough to stop trying to kill me, but she wanted me out of the apartment, like that night. I didn't even gather everything up. I just threw some essentials into a bag and got out of there. I kept imagining her sneaking up with a kitchen knife or something, catching me off guard and then just stabbing me to death or something. I've had friends ask me why I didn't just restrain her, why I was so scared of a girl. But that's about the dumbest response I've ever had to this whole story. A swing from that bat or a stab wound in the right place, it wouldn't have mattered what was or wasn't dangling between a person's legs. I'd have been dead as a doornail. I got out of there pretty fast, drove to a motel, then tried and failed to sleep through the rest of the night. The next morning, I called my mom in West Virginia, told her everything, and arranged to stay with her for a little while until I could get back on my feet. I'd have gone back to the apartment to get the rest of my things if I didn't think that she'd either smashed or burned everything I owned. Besides, I was just happier to be out of there by that point, and I'll tell you another thing. I have never, ever been back to Kentucky since then. I'll wait until Tyler Childers comes back round to Virgie, rather than bring up all those bad memories. Almost 10 years ago now, I'm in a college down in Florida when I get a call from my ex-girlfriend, who I'd only broken up with like 6 months previously. I didn't recognize the number at first, as I'd switched cell phone carriers not long prior. I'd never been one to answer calls from unknown numbers, but since I was in college, I used to get calls from professors, people over at Financial, people inviting me to D&D games in dorms and stuff like that. So I kind of nervously answered, just sort of hoping it was going to be about something good. I recognized the voice immediately, and as soon as I do, my heart just sinks. There was a reason I hadn't given her my new number, and I wondered just how she'd gotten hold of it. She's all like, "We need to talk." To which I replied that I'm not sure we really do. It had been like 6 months, and I thought we were out of each other's lives. She responds with like, "No, we really, really need to talk. Are you sitting down? Because I have something to tell you." She's pregnant. That was my initial thought, and I won't lie, I did feel myself getting weak in the knees. So I sit down on my bed, feeling my heart racing in my chest and my hands getting clammy, getting ready to hear the bad news. "We got a patient in the ER from a car accident, and she didn't make it. I'm so sorry, but it was your mom." Now, my ex worked as an emergency room nurse, and getting the news like that absolutely destroyed me. I was just in shock. For some reason, I tried calling her cell, but she didn't pick up. Of course she didn't pick up. So I hung up to call my little brother and give him the news. We cried like babies as I told him everything. How my ex had given me the news ahead of time, how she wasn't answering her phone, all that stuff. He confirmed that she'd driven over to Walmart like an hour or so ago and lamented not making the most of his last goodbye with her. Then, in the middle of us having some real heart-to-heart, I hear him just shout, "Mom," out of nowhere. She wasn't dead. She just walked through the door, super confused as to what was going on. Long story short, my ex had lied, and she did so because she wanted to hurt me, quote, just like I'd hurt her. This is about the point I tell you that I cheated on her with a girl in college, but was at least a man enough to admit it and have her break up with me. I'm not saying I didn't deserve some kind of revenge, but dear God, not that brutal. Ex-boyfriends can be terrible, sure, but some ex-girlfriends can be absolute psychos. On July 28, 1977, Travis Victor Alexander was born in Riverside, California, the son of Gary and Pamela Alexander. Travis's early years were marred by tragedy. At age 11, an unstable and ultimately toxic home life meant that Travis would be forced to go and live with his paternal grandparents. And after his father's tragic death in mid-1997, he was followed by his 7 brothers and sisters. Despite his rough upbringing, Travis performed rather well in school, attending college and eventually getting a job with a company known as Prepaid Legal Services as a salesman, and later as the company's motivational speaker, a position that paid considerably better. As part of his job at PPL, Travis would often attend conferences that took place in Las Vegas, plying his trade as a motivational speaker in front of audiences of hundreds. During one such conference in September of 2006, there was one particular woman in the audience who was enraptured by Travis's charisma and his talent for public speaking. She approached him afterwards, introducing herself and striking up a conversation that would spark off a long-term friendship. This woman's name was Jodi Arias. Jodi Ann Arias was born on July 9, 1980, in Salinas, California, to a mother of European ancestry and a father of Mexican ancestry. After she met Travis at the PPL conference, the pair grew increasingly close, which led to Jodi converting to Mormonism just 2 months later, actually being baptized by Travis himself at a ceremony that took place in Southern California. Despite the distance between them, the pair then began dating a few months later, and Jody even took the steps to move to Mesa and then Wairika, California, living in her grandparents' place so she could be closer to Travis. Travis and Jody had a tumultuous, on and off again relationship for almost a year and a half, often forced to maintain a long-distance relationship due to the fact that one of them lived in Arizona while the other had to remain in California for work. This kind of distance would put a strain on any relationship, but it appeared there were other factors at work that made Jody and Travis's relationship less than healthy. From the very first time that Travis introduced Jody to his close friends, they seemed to take an instant dislike to her. Jody didn't seem in the least bit keen to impress or ingratiate herself to them, seeming generally disinterested in anyone but Travis. His friends detected a kind of jealousy to her, how she seemed to act overly possessive of Travis, yet at the same time didn't seem to show him much affection either. From the get-go, they found Jody's behavior worrying, even frightening. Shortly after Jody moved into her grandparents' home in Wairika, she and Travis arranged to accompany one another on a week-long work-related trip to Cancun, down in Mexico. The trip was scheduled for June 15th, and the couple intended to make something of a vacation out of it. However, not long after, Travis reportedly went to company HQ to request that his travel companion be changed to another member of the sales team. There has been much speculation regarding why exactly this is, but our best guess is to assume that it involved a breakdown in his and Jody's relationship. Then on May 28th, Jody called Travis in a state of distress. She told him there had been a burglary at her grandparents' place where she was staying, and felt so unsafe that she begged to come and stay with him for a while. The burglars had apparently stolen a number of valuable items during the break-in, but perhaps the most significant was a .25 caliber Colt pistol which had belonged to her grandfather. Police had no luck finding the perpetrators, and eventually gave up looking altogether as they couldn't seem to find a single shred of evidence that might give them a clue to the identity of any of the people involved. In the face of Jody begging to stay with him, Travis straight up refused. This is perhaps the best evidence we have that their pair had broken up by that point. If Travis loved her or had any feelings at all for her, surely he would have offered her a place to stay. Only he didn't. Or maybe it was the case that Travis did love her, but something else was stopping him from inviting her over. It's possible that there have been many another woman in Travis's life. However, it's also possible that Travis didn't invite Jody over because he was afraid of her. Jody called Travis yet again on June 2nd, repeatedly attempting to reach him between the hours of 1 a.m. and 3 a.m., but her cell phone records show that, since the longest call was a mere 17 seconds, he apparently didn't pick up the phone. Then, just after 3 in the morning, Travis called Jody back, and the pair engaged in a lengthy conversation. We have no idea what was said during the call, but we do know that at around 5:30 that same morning, Jody drove over to a car rental place over in Redding, California, entering the business shortly after it opened at 8 a.m. She told the clerk that she wished to use the car for the long drive to Utah for a work-related trip, and then drove it to visit a few friends on her way to Utah, where she would meet up with a fellow PPL employee by the name of Ryan Burns. Yet Jody didn't show up to meet Ryan until late in the evening on June 3rd, leaving a sizable amount of time to be accounted for that day. And when she did show up in the West Jordan suburb of Salt Lake City to meet up with Ryan Burns, her colleague noticed some unusual things about her. Firstly, he saw that her normally dyed blonde hair was now brown, but not its natural shade of brown, and that she seemed to have cuts or scratches all over her hands. Jody also refused to let him near the rental car, insisting that they take his car to the PPL business conference. Naturally, Ryan thought this behavior was unusual, but the pair had more important things to think about, as the conference would keep each of them occupied for the majority of the day. Ryan had another reason to keep quiet about such unusual behavior, and that's because he and Jody had begun something of a love affair during their time in Utah, with the two spending several hours hugging and kissing on a large beanbag chair at the place that they were staying. Jody also reassured him about the cuts on her hands by telling him that she had gotten them while working part-time at a Mexican restaurant in the Wairika area, an excuse that seemed good enough for him to quiet his suspicions. Once their business was adjourned, Jody departed from Salt Lake City on June the 6th, driving back westward towards California. Her cell phone records showed that she attempted to call Travis several times, leaving a handful of voicemails, yet she apparently also found a way to access this voicemail system. Why exactly she chose to do so is still a matter of conjecture, but we can all agree that it constitutes some rather unusual behavior. When she returned the rental car to the outlet in Redding, the clerk began to inspect the interior as a matter of routine. It is then that he too noticed something unusual. The vehicle was missing its floor mats on the driver and passenger side. There were also some kind of stains on the upholstery, as if some thick liquid had been spilled and then left to dry. However, since the upholstery was black and the color of said liquid was not visible, no suspicions were raised among the staff at the car rental outlet, and the interior was clean before it could be inspected by anyone of any importance. Meanwhile, a few days prior, Travis's employers had tried to contact him for a conference call, only to have their calls unanswered. The same pattern repeated itself for a few days, with friends and colleagues calling only for Travis to not pick up his phone. By June 9th, as a handful of Travis's friends were beginning to worry amongst themselves regarding his well-being, they agreed to go over to his home to check up on him. They spoke to a few of the other tenants who lived in the same building as Travis did, and found that they had not seen him in a few days. But since he traveled for work frequently, they didn't seem to think that there was anything to worry about. However, one of Travis's neighbors was in possession of a spare key to his apartment, which Travis has entrusted them with on the off chance he should ever lose his keys. The concerned group of friends proceeded to unlock the door to Travis's apartment, calling out his name as they entered. Then one of them froze with a sharp gasp, pointing to a pool of congealed blood that sat in the hallway in Travis's bedroom. In a panic, they began to search the apartment for him, eventually being greeted by the sight of his days-old corpse, which was lying in the bathtub, covered in blood. His friends cried and screamed as they called 911, but they did not attempt to revive him, as it was obvious from the state of his dead body that he had been deceased for a while. During the 911 call that followed the discovery, a police dispatcher asked if Travis had potentially thought about ending his own life, or if his friends knew of anyone who may have been threatening his life. His friends immediately mentioned Jody Arias, his ex-girlfriend, as a possible suspect in his murder. He said that, in the days prior to his death, Travis had mentioned that Jody had been stalking him, accusing him of seeing someone else, and seemed to be in some kind of jealous rage. This psychopathic jealousy had led her to begin attempting to access his Facebook account, and even going so far as slashing his car's tires. When investigating police arrived at Travis's home, they commenced an intense search for any evidence or clues as to the identity of his killer. One of the most curious things they discovered was a recently purchased digital camera in the washing machine. Despite a large amount of water damage, police were able to recover the camera's memory card and found on it a number of photographs which someone had apparently attempted to delete. These photographs showed Travis and Jody in numerous suggestive poses taken on the afternoon of June 4th. The final photograph in the series was taken at 5:39 p.m. that same day and showed Travis alive and well while he was taking a shower. In it, he was smiling playfully, completely naked, a candid depiction of the man's final moments. As another photograph, taken just minutes later, showed Travis bleeding profusely while lying on the bathroom floor. DNA samples were taken from bloody handprints found in the bathroom, which gave police all the evidence they needed to arrest a suspect, as they contained not only Travis's DNA, but Jody Arias's too. After being indicted for first-degree murder by a grand jury in Maricopa County, Jody was arrested at her home in California and then extradited to Arizona on September 5, 2008. Less than a week later, she pled not guilty, giving several different accounts of her alleged involvement in Travis's death. At first, she told investigating police officers that she was nowhere near Arizona on the day her ex-boyfriend was murdered. Then, after pressure from the cops, she admitted she was present at the time of his death, but that it had involved a home invasion, whereby two individuals broke into Travis's residence before killing him and attacking her in turn. 2 years of investigation later, Jody then changed her story entirely, telling the police that she had indeed killed Travis, but had only done so in self-defense. She spun a tale of brutal domestic violence, how she was a victim of a cruel and violent man, and how she regularly feared for her life around him. At her trial in February of 2013, Jody told the jury that she had been physically and emotionally abused by her parents, and that her life with Travis had echoed that same cycle of abuse and guardianship, one that she wanted to escape from, but couldn't quite bring herself to. She went on to describe the abusive type of life that Travis subjected her to, one that included a great deal of BDSM and other painful acts, most of which were in direct violation of the Mormon rules regarding such things. Jody also had recorded a phone conversation that she had with Travis, one that she used as evidence to prove that at one point Travis had wanted to use zip ties to tie her to a tree while she was dressed as Little Red Riding Hood. Jody is heard to respond enthusiastically on the phone, but told the court it was all an act, that the idea terrified her, and was typical of the kinds of things that Travis wanted to do. Jody also mentioned that Travis had admitted to find underage children attractive, basically painting him to be a complete monster. However, the prosecution argued that Jody was a vengeful, vindictive person who had only recorded the phone conversation in an attempt to blackmail Travis and embarrass him in front of his Mormon peers. The prosecution also questioned a forensic expert before the jury, prompting them to say that there had been a thorough examination of Travis's computer, one in which absolutely had no evidence of child pictures found, nor were there any references to anything intimate with children. Rebuttal witnesses from the prosecution also included several of Travis's other girlfriends, who stated he never exhibited any problems with anger or violence. Clinical psychologist Janine DeMarthe testified for the prosecution, stating that she found no evidence that Travis had ever abused Jody. DeMarthe also said that Jody suffered from borderline personality disorder, showing signs of immaturity and an unstable sense of identity. The final nail in Jody's legal coffin was the prosecution telling the jury that a single .25 caliber bullet casing was found near Travis's body, the same caliber of the gun that was stolen from her grandparents' place just a week before the murder. As it turns out, Jody had faked the entire burglary just to obtain the murder weapon, which not only showed that she was a dangerous psychopath, willing to hurt those close to her to achieve her goals, but that she had actually been planning to kill Travis for quite some time. After the trial, that had reportedly cost the U.S. taxpayer over $3 million, the jury found Jody guilty of first-degree murder, and she only narrowly avoided the death penalty when a judge essentially took pity on her mental illness, sentencing her to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. She was also ordered to pay Travis's siblings over $30,000 in damages. As of 2016, Jody is housed at Arizona State Prison Complex, Perryville, and her case and trial have been the subject of a great deal of social media interest, with even Donald Trump commenting on what he called her obvious guilt. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the whole sordid drama is that Travis may well have genuinely believed that he had found the love of his life, and how in searching for the fairy tale romance that all people want deep down, he found the polar opposite, a living nightmare that would end in him losing his life to someone who could fairly be described as a conniving, violent, psychopathic predator. Relationships break down all the time, for a variety of reasons. People hurt, people cry, but most ultimately move on and find someone else. Jody took that chance away from Travis in a horridly callous and bloody manner. Instead of letting Travis go, she dragged him down like a sinking ship, one which neither of them will ever emerge from intact. At around 2 p.m. on Sunday, June 27, 2004, 17-year-old Craig Allen Freer was paying a visit to his ex-girlfriend at the Cambridge Manor apartment complex in Scotia, New York. Scotia is a small, quaint town of only around 8,000 people, situated just over 20 miles north of Albany in upstate New York. It hadn't been very long since they'd gone through a terrible and traumatic breakup, one that had left both teenagers heartbroken and depressed. It was so crushing for Craig that the depression that resulted from it had caused him to simply stop showing up to his job at the local price chopper. His manager had given him a few formal warnings at first, but once their initial worry had turned into frustration and disappointment, Craig was fired and promptly replaced. So it's clear that the event had a profoundly negative effect on Craig's mental well-being. But what's not clear is exactly why he'd driven over to his ex's apartment that day. He could have driven over to patch things up, for the romantic reunion of two teenage lovers, but it's also just as likely that one or both of them simply wanted proper closure, so that each could leave that chapter of their lives behind in peace. But Craig's visit to his ex was extremely poorly timed. You see, right about the time he was driving over to his ex's place, Craig's mom stopped by the price chopper to pick up a few grocery items. She wasn't the type of mom to deliberately embarrass her teenage son, but seeing him in his uniform while he worked hard always made her feel extra proud of him. But as she walked around the store, she couldn't see him anywhere, and had to learn from one of Craig's former colleagues that he had been fired as a result of endemic, unauthorized absences. She was furious, not only because she had to learn it in such a humiliating manner, but also because Craig had lied to her face about going to work that day. In fact, he had been deceiving his parents about the loss of his job for at least 2 weeks by this point, and his mother was now desperate to find out just where he had been going all that time. Craig's mom called his cell phone at the next available opportunity. She waited patiently as the dial tone buzzed away, but the call wasn't answered. She tried again, only to once again find that the call rang out. It wasn't diverted. Craig wasn't shutting down the call as to ignore her. In fact, it would turn out that he didn't have his cell phone at all during that time, that he had drove over to his ex's in such haste that he'd forgotten something he rarely neglected to carry on his person. This included his wallet, which he'd left behind in his bedroom with $40 in cash inside. However, Craig's mom was also no fool. She had a good idea where Craig might be and had also made a point of taking down his ex-girlfriend's landline number while they were still together. So she called her apartment, got an answer, and found that Craig was there. She confronted him with the knowledge that he had been fired from his job and informed him that she had already told his father the bad news. Craig then told her that he would drive back home in around 10 to 15 minutes once he was done talking to his ex. But Craig never arrived home. He was reported missing, and the first person the investigating police spoke to was his ex-girlfriend. She told them that after he had left his apartment, he had not gotten into his car but had instead walked off into the woods behind her apartment complex. This was evidenced by the fact that his vehicle was indeed still parked in the complex's parking lot. The police then discovered that the night before he disappeared, Craig slept at his friend Matthew Hollob's house. The pair had been friends since their final years of elementary school when they were co-captains of their high school soccer team. Matthew told the investigating officers that Craig was deeply upset and depressed regarding the breakup with his long-term girlfriend, but also told them that he had not even remotely hinted that he planned to run away or hurt himself, that doing so would be extremely out of character. The police then intensively searched the area where Craig was supposedly last seen, finding that there were numerous railroad tracks in the area. This was initially deeply concerning, but their search yielded nothing in terms of body parts or evidence that he had used a speeding train to end his own life. The wooded area also had numerous paths that connected Cambridge Manor with Craig's family home in the Yorkshire Court cul-de-sac, which was only a short distance away. 2 middle school students who also used the woodland paths to get to and from school also said they saw someone walking near the train tracks on the day in question, but whether or not this was Craig is almost impossible to know for certain. The area was searched numerous times by hundreds of different people, including professional law enforcement as well as unpaid civilian volunteers. Sniffer dogs were also used, but despite their great effectiveness in cases like Craig's, no serious evidence or clues were found. Similar searches of the nearby Mohawk River turned up nothing, leaving authorities completely stumped and leaving his family with no answers to the questions that plagued them. Police then appealed to the general public for information on Craig's potential whereabouts. The public was given a detailed description, one that stated how Craig was Caucasian, standing around 5'11", weighing about 190 pounds with red hair, brown eyes, and dimples. He apparently sometimes wore a goatee and was wearing a white short-sleeved t-shirt, blue jeans or jean shorts, white Adidas sneakers with 3 black stripes, and a gold chain with a St. Christopher medal at the time that he went missing. Almost 100 members of the New York State Police, both investigators and troopers, have been involved in the case over the years. The local Scotia Police investigated the case for around 2 years, before increasing complexities forced them to turn it over to the State Police in 2006. Investigator Gloria Coppola led the case until her 2015 retirement, which is when Detective Kevin Noto took over. Anytime you have a missing person case, until you find the person, you can't say the circumstances of the disappearance, State Police Major Crimes Investigator Kevin Noto said to journalists following Craig's disappearance. This is one where we are keeping our options open. People may have information they don't think is important, but oftentimes it is the little things in these cases that are the keys that open up that door, Noto said, adding that other people may have told police something early on in the investigation, but it's possible the tip was never passed on to the right person. Until you have something to work off of, you really don't know what kind of case you're dealing with. In some ways, missing person cases can be more difficult than a cold case homicide because, with a homicide, you know what kind of case you're working, Noto said. On the 15th anniversary of Craig's disappearance, just shy of what would have been his 30th birthday, his mother spoke to local journalists in a rare interview, during which she asked for privacy to be allowed to grieve in peace. All the time I think about it. What would he be doing? She said. The worst part is, for all of us, for his family, is we just miss him horribly. But the worst thing is knowing that there is somebody out there who knows what happened to my son, and I'm on my knees, hoping, praying there's someone out there who can help us understand what happened to my boy. Around the same time of the 15th anniversary, a group of concerned citizens from the Scotia and Glenville areas got together to organize a candlelit vigil to commemorate a tragedy that affected each and every one of them. It was partly organized in the hopes that their efforts would jog the memories of those who may have seen or heard anything around the time that Craig went missing, those who might come forward to the police with information, no matter how vague or unhelpful they might deem it to be. In cases like these, it seems even the most unlikely leads have the potential to produce results. It seems unlikely that Craig will ever be found. Investigating police have conducted almost 70 different search efforts over the years in an attempt to find any trace of human remains, clothes, or his belongings. These searches are usually conducted in spring or late fall when there is the least amount of snow or fallen leaf litter on the ground. Police have also frequently used sniffer dogs and their handlers out on foot patrols. Their goal is to search the route Craig would have taken back to his parents' house in the woods behind Cambridge Manor. Forensic divers and other nautical technicians have also been used to examine local streams, lakes, and rivers, but these searches have also turned out to be fruitless. Pete Irizzo, the former sports editor for the regional news publication The Times-Union, who was responsible for researching and writing about Freer's disappearance for many years, said the story had an indelible effect on him. He later recalled that when he first heard of Craig's mysterious disappearance, he thought, wow, how does a popular 17-year-old, a soon-to-be captain of his soccer team, just up and disappear from the face of the earth? The incident has affected Pete so much that every time he and his wife drive through the Scotia area, Craig's disappearance is one of the first things they think of. The idea of how someone could simply vanish without a trace is something that haunts him, even to this day. Pete is now the spokesperson for the University of Albany athletics program, having moved on from journalism entirely, but since he now has 2 young children, he lives in almost constant fear that they too could suffer a similar fate, and that he would also be left with a legion of unanswered questions. You can't imagine not knowing where your child is for 5 minutes, but 15 years not knowing? Pete said in a recent interview with his former employers. The article is quick to note that Pete sounded genuinely disturbed and distressed when talking about the case. Freer's social security number has not been used since his disappearance, indicating that he has not paid taxes, opened a bank account, or applied for a job in the United States. This led us to believe that either he has managed to fake an entirely new identity, which would prove extremely difficult and time-consuming, or more likely that he is deceased, which raises the question, what would exactly have killed Craig that day, and for what reason? It seems that there are two very likely explanations that have been completely neglected by investigating police. The first being that Craig was murdered by his ex-girlfriend, who pursued him through the woods before attacking him, possibly with a firearm, before somehow disposing of his body in such an effective way that the police would have been unable to find it. Yet there are a few serious holes in this theory, the first being that Craig was something of a big guy and did a lot of training as part of his high school soccer program. Not only would he have been difficult to overpower or chase after, but moving and disposing of his body without leaving any DNA or forensic traces would be near impossible for his girlfriend, who wasn't nearly as tall or strong as she would have needed to be to perform such a feat. However, if there was another man in her life, one that was supremely and violently jealous of Craig, there could well be a chance that it was this person that took it upon themselves to remove Craig from the picture. There could well be a chance that this was on the orders of Craig's ex-girlfriend herself, that she planned the idea in her new boyfriend's head to get rid of the guy that was bothering her so much. But as it stands, these ideas are pure speculation, even if they are the most likely, given that the ex-girlfriend was the last person Craig visited before he disappeared. Craig may have simply vanished from the face of the earth, but there simply must be remnants that remain behind, no matter how difficult these are to find. Whether or not great scrutiny of his ex-girlfriend is required in order to find them is perhaps the most pertinent question we are left with. The fact remains that the final act on his earth, it seems, was for Craig to go and visit her, so it seems obvious that the key to finding him lies with her. Relationships turn sour, go wrong, and fall apart all the time, but very few end in a death or disappearance. There could be no way Craig could possibly have known that visiting his ex that day would have resulted in the end of his life, but again, the fact remains that on this occasion, for this young man, a visit to an ex proved to be as deadly as it was unwise. At the end of last summer, I was just about sick to my back teeth of dating apps. But somehow, I just couldn't quite bring myself to delete them. Maybe it was an inspired determination to never give up, or maybe it was just the fear of spending my 30s alone. But either way, I ended up just moving them to the second page of my iPhone menu. I could still get notifications and whatnot, but they'd be out of sight, out of mind. Then exactly 10 days after I'd almost sworn them off, I met Howla. She was a good 6 years older than me, and she lived in the next city over, but that didn't bother me, not in the least bit. You see, she was beautiful. A small Arab woman with bouncy natural curls and rich amber eyes that were framed with the most adorable little freckles. Although she didn't make a big deal about it, you could tell she worked out, and to top it off, she was a hematology consultant, like the top blood doctor for miles and miles around, a literal boss lady. Needless to say, I was smitten. Our first date was in a Middle Eastern restaurant called Bab, and it went very well indeed. We clicked as well as we had in text, and we ended up falling into bed together that very same night. She cried when it was over, telling me she'd never done that on a first date before. I just held her, told her I've got you, and promised that she wouldn't live to regret it. We had breakfast the next morning, and it was just as magical as the previous evening. A second date, a little over 12 hours after the first, which was pretty unprecedented for me. That evening we had dinner again, with her introducing me to traditional Libyan food, something that was very dear to her as her country of origin's cuisine. I think I might be a little biased in saying it was incredible, but trust me, it was good. That night, neither of us wanted me to catch the train back to my home city, so I stayed another night, and so began an intense but brief relationship. We talked every single day for months, swapping photos we'd taken of sunsets and parkland vistas, captioning them with, "You should be here," "I miss you," and the like. Being a top-tier doctor, she was far too busy saving lives to ever see me during the week, but we spent almost every weekend together, visiting fancy restaurants in between watching French movies, as she was fluent in the language, and little tours that she'd give me of the grand city that she called home. Everything was going incredibly, at least until one weekend when we couldn't see each other because she was going back to Yorkshire to see her parents. She seemed a wee bit quiet for the duration, but I took that on the chin. Even though she was 38, I knew her parents were very, very strict and that her mum adhered to a particular kind of Islam that is known as Salafi or Wahhabi. Those are the kind that don't believe in things like singing or dancing, and even take issue with stringed instruments for some reason. So, naturally, the idea of her unmarried daughter having a boyfriend was out of the question, let alone a non-Muslim one. So like I said, I understood why she didn't want to get caught. I understood why she had set her WhatsApp setting to not display messages on the lock screen, and I understood why she never saved me as a contact. God knows what they'd do if they found out about me, and it really didn't bear thinking about it. But even when she got back to the flat she lived in, even when she was rid of her parents for another few weeks, she seemed a little cold. However, a week or so went by, and she seemed to return to being her normally warm and affectionate self. So, for the next few months or so, I didn't think anything of it. All the strange negativity that she'd brought back from her parents' place was forgotten. Right up until the time around her birthday, when she'd once again promised them that she'd make the trip home to see them. Needless to say, I was prepared for some turbulence, but I had absolutely no idea how bad things were about to get. It ended the Monday after she got home. We had a massive fight about the future, how we were basically doomed, how her parents would never accept a non-Muslim or anyone who earned under 6 figures a year. I talked about the prospect of me converting religiously or maybe writing her father a formal letter in Arabic asking for his permission to marry her. I knew he'd respect that, but the idea just terrified her. "You're too optimistic," she'd say. "Too young. Too naive." We continued to argue, but she just settled in the excuse of, "I just don't have time for a relationship right now. I'm sorry. What we had was nice, yes, but that's all in the past. Hate me. Just hate me. It'll be easier to let me go that way." I knew something had happened back at her parents' place, something that tipped her over the edge of pessimism and into full-on doomsaying. I begged her to tell me what it was, but she wouldn't. She denied anything bad even happening at all. But I could always tell when she was lying, and she was never any good at it. After that, after I failed to convince her to stay, it was all just tears and apologies, until I finally got the balls to just say, "Ma salama, ya habibi, Allah hafiz." Goodbye, my darling. God protect you. I tried to keep in touch after the breakup. She was someone that had achieved so much in their life but was, by their own admission, a little messed up. I didn't want to just abandon her because she'd broken my heart. She said it herself. She said that she'd like to keep in touch but was worried it would blur the lines, how it was better if we didn't have any emotional attachments, since it was so heartbreaking that two people who got on so well just didn't have any kind of future together. I assured her, as best as I could, that it wouldn't be that way. I just kept trying to weasel back into her life. I genuinely just wanted to stay in touch. In her own words, she would always reply to messages, but she didn't. The very next day her replies dropped off and eventually petered out altogether. It was crushing. Something must have happened to her, I thought, but I tried to push the idea out of my head. It was a pathetic attempt to reassure myself that she still wanted to talk. She just couldn't. There had been a car accident. She lost her phone. She was sick, maybe. All these worried thoughts came flooding into my head, all in an attempt to replace the devastating reality that she just didn't give a monkey's toss about me anymore, that she was cold-hearted enough to just cut me out of her life. Like I said, I tried my best to force such ideas out of my head, but the more I tried, the more they got a grip on me, and one day, I just decided to call her, just to see how she was doing. My heart pounded in my chest as the phone rang, mainly from anticipating the pain that would hit me when I heard her say something along the lines of, "Oh God, leave me alone, I'm blocking this number." But her mobile just went to voicemail over and over again, and I tried calling a lot that day at different times just to make sure. She wasn't responding on any of her social media accounts either, not a single one. None of the messages were even being read, and she always read her WhatsApp messages, always. Even if she wasn't going to reply, she'd read them. The next day I tried her at work, the same adrenaline pumping through me as I expected to hear the worst. But when the call was picked up and I heard a voice on the other end, I immediately recognized that it wasn't her. "You're through to Dr. Peterson," they said. It was a male voice. I asked the guy if I could speak to Dr. Howla. I used her second name, but I'm not prepared to give that one out here, and to my shock, he told me that she hadn't been into work for the past 2 weeks, that as far as he knew, she didn't work in that hospital anymore. I asked if she was okay, and he had no idea, that he'd been transferred there a few weeks prior to fill a temporary consultancy position. She loved that job. She said it was her future. She once told me getting that consultant's position was the greatest achievement of her life. Something was wrong, and I could feel it in my bones. As crazy as it sounds, I decided to try and visit her at her apartment in the next city over. Even if she was home, had moved jobs, and just told me to get lost, at least it would ease my mind. At least I'd know she was okay. I rang on her apartment intermittently for hours, hoping she'd either answer or I could catch her returning home. Eventually, I saw one of her neighbors walking into the apartment building, and I summoned the courage to ask her about Howla. He didn't know her by name, but he did have some information, telling me he'd seen some people moving some furniture out of the apartment about a week prior. I asked him if it was a moving company or something, and he said no, just 3 Arab-looking people, 2 older, 1 younger. I pestered him for a description of them, and from what I could tell, it sounded like her mum, dad, and brother. I pressed him on whether or not that he'd actually seen Howla, and he told me no one fitting her description was there that day, and he'd been in and out of his flat an awful lot. My last move was to track down a phone number for her dad. Getting hold of the family landline would at least give me an idea if she was okay or not. The best case scenario was that she just moved back in with her parents for whatever reason, be it a breakdown or maybe to look after one of them if they were sick or something. I mean, the whole situation just seemed really unusual, and I had a terrible feeling in the pit of my stomach that something was very, very wrong. Since he was a retired doctor, it was relatively easy to find his number. I just lied to an old colleague of his, telling them I was an old patient that wanted to say thank you. But when I called, what I was told had me absolutely terrified. I know it was the right person. I know from the cute little impressions Howla used to do of him, I know I was talking to her dad. But the man I spoke to said he had no daughter named Howla. But not in the confused, bewildered manner you'd expect from a genuine case of mistaken identity. He got angry, really angry, and before he hung up the phone, never to answer it to me again, he told me he knew who I was, that I'd made a serious mistake and that if I ever called again, he'd be contacting the police. But it's me that's going to be contacting the police because I think something terrible has happened to her, and I think her parents are responsible with some help from her brother. She'd only mentioned once or twice how controlling they were, how they'd kill her if they ever found out that we were together. I always thought she meant metaphorically, never literally. But for the past few months, I'm starting to think otherwise. I think my ex's parents found out about us, and I think they may have murdered her. I have no way to prove it, and the police won't listen to me. I tried to report her missing, but the policewoman I spoke to said that they got a call from a woman in Switzerland who assured them that she was Howla and that she wasn't missing at all. Only I know for a fact that she has a sister in Geneva who works for the WHO, one who might well be easily convinced to lie to protect her parents. It's way beyond her just ignoring me at this point, Surely she'd have contacted me and told me to stop looking for her, to just give up. But she hasn't, and she was always such a lioness, never afraid to tell me what she was thinking. I just hope I can get to the bottom of this one day, but it terrifies me to think that a girl could just be disappeared by her own parents. And if that really is the case, then I won't rest until they face justice. I won't stop until I find Howla. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/LetsReadOfficial, and give and receive feedback from the community, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And join my Discord to interact with me and other listeners directly. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all these stories in long compilation form and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the bio. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, isn't that what it means to be a scientist? To push the boundaries of the unknown, to bravely, actively explore the enormity of our butts.